the state of transportation policy and infrastructure funding in the Biden administration. My guest is James H. Burnley, former U.S. Secretary of Transportation and now a partner in the law firm of Venable LLP. Hello, Mr. Burnley.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Where do you think infrastructure will rank among the priorities of the Biden administration in the first few weeks and months?
Well, clearly, it's very close to the top of the list. So as an aspirational matter, they intend to try to put together, as they've said many times, a major infrastructure package.
Mm-hmm. As has been attempted on many, many occasions, bringing together
many occasions.
Exactly. Now, I'm wondering, though, what lessons did you learn in your time as Secretary of Transportation about how to advance the cause of infrastructure funding, and what might the biggest obstacles might be?
Well, there are a couple of very good questions in what you just asked. In terms of what I've learned, both in my time at the Department of Transportation and since then, over many years of working on these infrastructure issues, is that everybody agrees in principle that we want to invest in the infrastructure. We have debates about specific projects. We have an ever-growing list of concerns that need to be addressed before we go forward on specific projects. But in the abstract, everybody thinks infrastructure is something worthy of federal investment. The difficulty comes both in defining ultimately what that means, and that definition, I think, is very much going to be debated in the months to come. And secondly, how you pay for it. And although we are in a period where it seems that the traditional concerns, particularly among Republicans about deficit financing, have gone out the window, and we're spending trillions that we're borrowing at warp speed, I think that can be misleading because we have an existential crisis for this country. So of course, it's like a war. Of course, you spend whatever you need to spend. But I think as the vaccine is administered in a very widespread way and the crisis recedes, hopefully soon, that those traditional concerns about deficit financing will reemerge with a vengeance. And in both parties, I think there are a fair number of Democrats who will be concerned as well. So then the debate has two facets, broad brush. One is what in 2021 do we want to include for funding in the infrastructure basket? And that is, I think, going to be a robust debate. The other debate is where's the money going to come from? And we have not raised fuel taxes in this country on the federal level in almost 30 years. Interestingly, quite a few of the states have raised fuel taxes in recent years. But the federal rate has not gone up, and even though we're seeing basically zero inflation now, and we've had on the whole modest inflation over that 30-year run, nonetheless, inflation adds up. So we both don't have any kind of inflation factor built into federal fuel taxes. They're stagnant. They stay at one level until Congress changes it. And on the other hand, the cost of any given infrastructure project has increased substantially over 30 years. Therefore, the Highway Trust Fund for the last 5 or 6 years has been receiving in tax receipts ever greater, creating ever greater deficits. And we're now at the point where the Highway Trust Fund is really almost a fiction in the sense that Congress has to keep pouring so much money into the Highway Trust Fund on the Treasury books for general revenues that it's really not working like the trust fund is intended to work anymore. So we got to figure out the pay for side of it, and I think there'll be a lot of pressure to do that, and then the definition of how we spend the money.
Aren't we even having a philosophical debate as to whether the Highway Trust Fund and the federal fuel tax should in fact be the source of funding for infrastructure going forward? I think there are those who would say no.
Well, I don't know of much of a debate about whether there should be some kind of a tax structure dedicated to the Highway Trust Fund that covers highway and transit programs. There seems to be a broad consensus still that that should be the case. We are finally, and I think it's overdue, I think it's a decade overdue at least, having a debate and an ever more vigorous debate about whether a cents per gallon fuel tax can work anymore, particularly as both federal and state policies push aggressively on those of us who buy vehicles to move away from gasoline and diesel powered vehicles to electric vehicles. And we've already got a situation where you've got several million electric vehicles, including hybrids, on our roads. And arguably the equities are not there. Those folks are getting literally a free ride. They're not contributing at the gas pump like those who have either diesel or gasoline powered vehicles.
So how about a vehicle use tax? How about a vehicle use tax such as that which was experimented with in the state of Oregon and elsewhere?
Well, I think you're referring to a vehicle miles traveled.
Vehicle miles traveled, yes.
VMT, yes, as it's known. And that, I think, is the only equitable outcome of this debate. And that's getting ever more attention at long last. That's a debate I wish had been more robust 10 years ago. But yes, several states, Oregon was first, but they're even experimenting with it on a voluntary basis in California. I think Washington State has done something, and there's one other Western state, I'm not sure which one, maybe Idaho, that's experimenting. There are legitimate privacy concerns about tracking our driving for reporting, to pay a fee. I think those can be easily addressed. The technology does not require that we turn in a map of where we've been. So I think that debate will be a very big part of the overall infrastructure debate starting this year.
We're also hearing a lot more discussion, much more than we did in your days as Secretary of Transportation, about the necessity of public-private partnerships in funding infrastructure projects around the country. Do you believe that is an inevitability going forward?
It has to be because, again, I think there are increasing concerns once the pandemic is over, prospective concerns about deficit financing. And in fact, the deficit financing we're doing now, driven by the pandemic, I think is going to put a lot of additional pressure on members of Congress and the Biden administration in thinking about all this and where it leads, because we've added trillions of dollars of debt so quickly to the national debt. So I think that there'll be a lot of discussion about how we go forward, who pays for what. And I'd like to think that can all get sorted out this year. I'm not entirely optimistic that will be the case.
And if the money should finally be in place, and of course that is the big, enormous hurdle to be overcome first, then the question is, where does the money go? What about the competing interests of passenger versus freight? What about interests between different modes of transportation? You were in the middle of that battle as Secretary of Transportation, and now the new secretary will be as well. How do you balance those competing interests?
Well, it's a constant process. It's not stagnant. It's very dynamic. And first and foremost, if you're Secretary of Transportation, you have to play within the legislative guidelines that Congress creates. You don't have, a free hand to move the money around. In fact, the amount of money that the leadership of the Department of Transportation has discretion over is a relatively small percentage of the overall budget of the department. But to come back to your point, because I think it's relevant, about public-private partnerships, we were talking about those, particularly in the late 1980s, and trying to encourage interest in developing that concept. And it has developed to a very substantial degree because public resources have fallen short. Well, to your question about how do you sort out what's worth investing in, private investors tend to have a pretty sharp eye as to, they're not perfect. There's certainly a number of stories of public-private partnerships that financially didn't work. But on the whole, private investors have a pretty sharp eye about how they're going to get any kind of a return on their investment. And that in and of itself creates a bit of a sorting process. Ultimately, the overlay of that has to be public policy at the federal, state, and local levels about where the funds should go. I mean, at this point, for example, if someone were, and no one is, but someone were to propose adding 10,000 miles to the interstate highway system, there would be a very loud outcry in opposition to that.
Yeah.
And then we have the traditional debate that's still going on in a very robust way about, even out of the Highway Trust Fund, how much should go to transit versus how much should go to roads. So,
and today, these days, I imagine
there are no simple answers, and the answers.
Yeah, I didn't expect you to give them to me today. I just was hoping we could outline some of these issues. Of course, in a time where we are becoming more ecologically conscious,
Yes.
and transit is becoming a bigger issue, and we are seeking clean energy sources, I would have thought that the priorities toward infrastructure investment would shift toward things that are considered to be, quote unquote, greener. Therefore, away from highways, away from big trucks, away from things like that, and thereby once again challenging the interests of freight interests who need those roads in order to get product to market.
You're entirely correct about that.
So
that is a part of the debate, a very important part. And on the other hand, the folks who say we don't need to invest anymore in the road system and it should all go into the public transit, are also busy ordering online and expecting the packages to show up within 4 hours, sometimes within 8 or 10 hours on their doorsteps.
Right.
And you can't have it both ways ultimately.
Yeah.
You've got to maintain a highway and road structure that permits the efficient flow of freight as well as people.
You also raised a very interesting issue on the private investment side. People just think we could wave a magic wand and private industry will come roaring in with money. But as you point out, a private industry needs an incentive to invest, needs a return on its investment at some point. And
Right.
These projects don't necessarily on their face seem to be big revenue creating ventures down the road unless everything is going to be subject to tolls. Is that what we're facing, a future of tolls in order to recapture the cost of investment?
I think we're facing a future of ever greater use of tolls and, as we talked about a few moments ago, vehicle miles traveled, which is basically conceptually nothing more than a toll.
Sure.
I mean, you're being charged for how much you use the system, the road system. So yes, I think that is the way we will be going, and that not only makes it over time easier to attract private capital to worthy projects that public capital may not be able to afford entirely, but it also helps sort out projects that may not make sense. If it looks like people don't need that new lane or that new road sufficiently to be willing to pay for it, either through a VMT or through tolls, then it's unlikely that private equity is going to have an interest in that project.
Yeah. So I heard a little glimmer of optimism in something you said earlier, hoping that some of these issues can be addressed this year. Do you think that we stand a chance of transportation and infrastructure being high enough on the list of priorities of Congress and the Biden administration to see real progress in 2021?
There's a chance, but the Congress is, as you know, very closely divided between the parties. And in the Senate, it's literally 50-50. So you have to reach a substantial consensus on a big issue for Congress to be able to go forward. And we've touched upon a number of the facets of infrastructure issues so far in this conversation that will be difficult to reach a consensus on, in my judgment. If you want to replace fuel taxes with the vehicle miles traveled tax, almost certainly you're not going to do that overnight. And there will be people who are adamantly opposed to doing it at all and who will simply say, raise the fuel tax 75% or 50% or whatever it might be. There are others who will say the fuel tax does not work anymore. We're giving a free ride literally to people that don't use petroleum-based products. And they've got to have an opportunity to pay their pro rata share based on their usage. So that's not an easy debate. And again, as I said, I wish we'd really entered into that debate in a serious way a decade ago. It's going to take a while.
Mm-hmm.
And people are pretty dug in on both sides. I mean, when you talk about the trucking industry, for example, as you know, the trucking industry traditionally has been opposed to tolls. The trucking industry for years has advocated for increased fuel taxes. They have not been successful in getting increased fuel taxes on the federal level. They have been, again, with other interests on the state level in quite a few states, but not on the federal level in nearly 30 years. So these are not easy debates. There are large economic stakes for both the public and the private sector. And you've got debates within debates. You're talking about who should be paying how much for road usage on the one hand, what the mechanism is, and on the other hand, as we've alluded to, you're talking about what the ratio should be on the federal level of expenditures on transit versus roads. There is a movement in this country that is becoming ever louder to dismantle portions of the interstate highway system, led by a group called the Congress for New Urbanism. And they have a hit list of, 10 or a dozen segments, usually in urban areas, that they believe should literally be taken down. So
wow.
I think that their voices are going to be pretty loud in the halls of Congress this year.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are so many moving parts here in terms of coming together in Congress and with the Biden administration on a consensus on how you pay for it, how much you spend on what, and then the countless sub-issues. The environmental review process has gone through reform in the last 3 administrations, Republican and Democratic. But because of the strength of the Green movement in the Biden administration, we may face yet another version of reform that may go in the opposite direction from the Trump administration.
Yeah.
That will play into the legislative debate. So again, I'm optimistic the debate will be joined. I'm not optimistic that it'll get done in 2021.
Certainly no easy answers, but James Burnley, I want to thank you so much for joining me today with your insights into what are the big issues that we face in transportation and infrastructure funding and development in the coming year and beyond. Thank you very much for your time.
Happy to be with you. Thank you.